Everyone, this is the video that a lot of you have been waiting for. I talk about my 2023 numbers, and we're gonna get very numbery in this video. So I would definitely recommend getting a very strong cup of coffee. Tea in my case, we've actually all been sick for the past month because my daughter just, of course, brings home the best of daycare's germs. So we are still recovering. Today's the first day of the new year. And the reason why it took so long for me to make this video is because I was still making sales all the way up till the last day. And even today on New Year's, I had someone pick up wholesale stems, right? So flowers are constantly going out and the numbers are constantly changing. But I finally have everything down between my sales and my costs. And this is a video where we're going to go into detail about just how my second year looked. So I'm giving everyone these numbers because the videos that I found online to be the most helpful for me, especially before I ever even considered flower farming and just thinking about it as a potential, were those videos that gave those numbers. So for example, Flower Hill Farm, that's Nicole. She did my financial reality of flower farming. Super, super eye-opening. Ian and Serena from You Can't Eat the Grass also has done multiple videos talking about the finances of their farm. And there have been other videos, actually, when I think about it, there's another one, b.a.r.e from Blossom and Branch, who did one last year on her numbers and she full-time farms and what that looks like. So a lot of them were very eye-opening. And I know that other non-flower farmers also make this kind of content, but it's honestly hard to see it in the flower farming world. And everyone's situation is going to look super, super different. So the context for everyone here is I'm going to look probably the most different because I don't flower farm full-time, nor do I honestly ever have the intention as of right now to do it. I do enjoy my job. My job pays well in all transparency to the point where, my husband actually doesn't need to work. It allows us a lot of flexibility from a childcare perspective. If daycare calls, he's the primary caretaker, and I don't have to do as much in the form of household chores. Of course, I contribute, but not to extent that a typical working mom would have to in a dual working household, right? So there's a lot of benefits of me working full-time, especially in a job that I enjoy. And I put all of this in perspective because this video is for you guys out there who are flower farming as a side hustle, who have that daytime job, and I'm here to show you what my year looked like. I'm pretty proud with how I came out of the year. So the number was obviously in the title, you know how much I made. But here's the thing, that number doesn't tell you much because that number only tells you the sales. It doesn't tell you the types of sales that I had, which I'll go into detail. But more importantly, it doesn't tell you how much it cost me to get to those sales, which therefore means, or the question is, was I profitable or not, right? And that's what we're going to get to in the heart of this video. Before we dive into the numbers, I think it's really important that I start laying out some context for everyone about my flower farming situation. And that is relevant information for you because then you can decide, hey, this sounds like my situation and maybe it could be applicable to me. I can learn some things that are transferable, or maybe it's completely not relatable to me and therefore this is just a nice to know. So first off, I mentioned before that this is a side hustle. So I do flower farm on the side. I have a day job, 9 to 5. That 9 to 5 job does require me to go in 3 days a week, which does make a difference because it means that I have to rethink about crops that I overwinter. I can't be going out back and forth covering and uncovering. I would say that I was probably stuck in meetings basically through 9 to 5 during the day when I was working remotely, but you get those breaks, those lunch breaks where you can go out and inside, assuming you're farming on your property, which I am, but now I don't have that ability. So I'm not really overwintering that much ranunculus this year because I don't have the capability to go out and babysit them, right? So that's like one thing that really makes me rethink about just what I grow and how I grow. The second thing is that you might have seen my husband, Eric, make appearances in some of my videos or on social media. Eric does play a small role on this farm, but for the most part, I am a one-woman show. Eric helps when I ask him to. He's usually involved in driving the tractor around, getting me wood chips, getting me soil or compost, or reinforcing pallets so that I could put my lilies on there when I needed season extension. So things like that, right? But he is not in the day-to-day. I am the one who is growing, who is harvesting, who is doing the selling, the marketing. And then there's this YouTube part of it, which I am for the most part filming, and I am editing all of it by myself. Eric is now making a little bit more of an appearance in terms of being my filmographer in certain videos, so that's not always like a vlog type of format, but I would say for the most part, Eric's involvement is minimal, right? So very relevant for you guys out there who feel like that you're just flower farming by yourself. I mean, it is definitely helpful to have Eric's help, but he is, in all honesty, a small part of the farm as of right now. Things might change depending on how things go, especially with winter tulips. The third piece of context here specific to this year is I did have a baby in the spring, which meant that I didn't know what to expect for this year. I actually didn't really have many goals. I had like a very soft sales goal, which I blew out of the water because things went a lot better than I expected. So that meant that though I had about 3 weeks before I gave birth off. We have a nesting period that my company grants me. And then I had about 3.5 months off before I went back to work. So that's effectively about 4 months. And I would say that in the 3.5 months after I gave birth, I was luckily able to recover quickly enough where I feel like I was really able to grow this flower farming business. So that was big because I don't know without this mat leave if I honestly would have been able to accomplish what I did this year, especially in the wholesale realm. One more thing before we get into numbers, and I promise it'll be really soon. I want to talk about one of the biggest takeaways for me for 2023. And it is that success is when opportunity meets luck. I think Thomas Edison said that. But this was super, super relevant for me in 2023. I think that a lot of times our success is really due to a function of our hard work paired with just random sheer dumb luck that none of us have control over. But it's a matter of recognizing those opportunities. And some of those opportunities may be so obvious that they are smacking you in the face, and some of them will actually be so subtle that it's easy to miss them. So I am going to be mindful about pointing out where those subtle opportunities were for me this year and how I seized them and what that did for my flower farming business as a result. Without further ado, let's get started into the numbers. So in 2023, as you saw in the title, I brought in $23,704. That is a number I'm proud of, whether or not I had a baby. I think that my original goal was something like 10,000. Again, I didn't know what to expect. So close to $24,000 feels like I really hit it out of the ballpark. But here's the really important part for me to now talk about. Not all of those sales came from flowers, right? So this is where I think it's going to start getting interesting for some people. When I look at my total flower sales, I only sold $10,551. Again, that's not necessarily a small amount. It's just 45% of that total number that I gave you. And I would say that for that $10,551 that I sold, I had flowers throughout all 12 months of the year. Some months, obviously, I had more than others, but I was very consistent. And I would even say that it was a lot of hard work getting to that amount versus some other people who focus on like 1 or 2 sales outlets, and they can get that with a fraction of the time that I spent. But I do think that it was really important for me to pursue a bunch of different outlets for me to gather enough data to then say to myself, hey, is this worth pursuing further? Does this have opportunity? And just to get to know what it's like selling in those outlets. So I do think that that was time well spent. And I'm going to talk in detail about the wholesale piece of it, which like we're going to break down that $10,500 number. But you're probably wondering yourself, so then what was the balance of that number that got me to close to 24,000? It wasn't all YouTube. If I would say that the balance of that was actually YouTube derivative, meaning it wasn't just ad income from YouTube, but it was my ability to recognize an opportunity that came from YouTube to use YouTube as my lead generation. So we're going to get into the details of that. But let's talk first about my breakdown of flower revenue. So I'm going to put that on a screen here just because I think it's easier for people to see visually. But for the most part, my sales were predominantly still retail this year. And I did that through a combination of a la carte bouquets and a CSA subscription. So I had three high-level CSA subscriptions. I had one for early spring, one in the summer for lilies, and then now a winter tulip subscription, which actually began on the last day of December. And so I was able to recognize some revenue through there. So my goal going forward is to shift more of those sales to wholesale. And the reason being is because it is just a lot less effort for me to sell wholesale. From a labor perspective, from just being able to drop everything off at my co-op on this one day. Yes, it's annoying to wake up at like 4:30 a.m., drive an hour south and then 2 hours back up. But I would say that that is still more efficient than me trying to sell wholesale on my own or even retail for that matter. So let's talk a little bit about my florist piece here. So I only sold $3,453 here, which is about 33%. Again, I really hustled for those sales because that is a really, really low number for the amount of time that I spent. But when I think about what I learned this year selling wholesale, right? So again, I sell predominantly wholesale through a cooperative with other growers. So we come together as a team. We provide all these flowers to dozens of designers who come from all around New Jersey, New York City, and Philadelphia to buy our blooms. And these are designers typically who are using it for their events. So just being the presence of these more experienced growers, seeing like how they harvest, picking their brains, what do they grow? It was like getting a grower's MBA in a season. If anything, I felt like I should have paid money to be in that co-op, right? So getting into that co-op was one of those opportunities that like slapped me in the face because someone who was on the co-op board actually reached out to me after seeing one of my YouTube videos and realizing I was in New Jersey and was like, hey, do you want to be a grower? I had actually seen this co-op before, looked at their application and was a little bit intimidated. And so therefore I held off on applying. And again, because I was going to have a child, I was like, I don't know how much I could commit. But because the opportunity was almost given to me, I was like, I have to take this, right? And then later on, I found out that the person who reached out to me had just had a baby the year before. And then there were two other members of the co-op who were giving birth around the same time as me. So I didn't join just to sell wholesale. I joined for the community of having moms with very young children and seeing how we were able to navigate through our journeys. And that was awesome. Like the co-op was one of the highlights of my year. Now, next year, if I'm only going to sell $3,400, it's definitely not going to be worth my time because again, the majority of the time this year when I went to the co-op, I was on mat leave. I didn't have to drive back up to work, which is in the opposite direction. This year, I need to make every single co-op visit count, which means that I am growing more deliberately for the florists of that co-op. Now let's talk a little bit more about the retail side because I do think that talking about the farmers market sales, which comprise the 15% of all of my flower sales, is noteworthy. I did not re-sign up for my farmers market this year. It was a great experience last year, but what I found was that spring and fall were like the highlights. And then in the summer, people go on vacation. It's really, really hot. It just like, it wasn't worth the effort of being at the farmers market for just early spring and fall when there was more demand. So unbeknownst to me, I would be asked to join as a guest vendor throughout the season because there was no official cut flower vendor. There was a vegetable farmer who brought some cut flowers and then there was a landscaper who brought some cut flowers, but they were not like specifically there for cut flowers, which meant that there were weeks or multiple weekends where there were no cut flowers. And I happened to have worked with a market manager who believed that every single farmer's market should have fresh cut flowers. So she invited me for Mother's Day. She invited me a few other times. And then there was, I think, 2 instances where I reached out to her saying, hey, I have a lot of blooms. Would you mind if I come to sell this weekend? And she was like, absolutely, please come. So that $1,500 worth was spread over 5 markets. Mother's Day, I sold out within 17 minutes. Just one of those days where you always wish you had more flowers. She contacted me like literally about 36 hours beforehand. Otherwise, if I had known at least 2 weeks in advance, I would have hoarded some more of my tulips. But, you know, it was still a really good day. And that was one of those days where I was still feeding the baby. I hadn't started pumping yet. So I was able to leave within like half an hour. And that was really, really time well spent. But the reason why I talk about this is because, again, like certain opportunities that you don't think may exist in the beginning of the year will just naturally come up in the middle of the year for you to move those stems. And I found that the farmer's market, although it's not something that I want to be at regularly, is still a very good outlet, because after year 1, I started establishing a customer base. And because I was a guest vendor, people would be more likely to want to come out to the farmer's market to buy my blooms because they knew that I would not be there in another 2 weeks. In fact, they wouldn't know if I would be there at all, and nor would I, right? So farmer's markets take a little bit of time to build that clientele, especially if you're not in a super busy farmer's market. They can work. They obviously require just a lot of time to create that type of customer base. And it could really work out if you hire that out, right? Hire someone who's going to sit at the farmer's market for you weekend after weekend. The last piece here on the country farm, which had a very, very small number of $160 because we only did it for about a month and a half, and it was 2% of all the sales. I think that this outlet has potential going forward. I'm going to try to make it a priority because I don't know if I'm going to do another CSA in the spring, and I'm going to cut back on a la carte bouquets, especially those that get delivered. And I'm gonna favor this country store. This country store is literally like under 3 miles away from me. And it's just a really great outlet for if I have extra blooms to just go there. So for example, after the co-op on Wednesdays, if I can't sell stuff and I'm able to bring the blooms back, that's a great outlet for me to then put those blooms and mixed bouquets in and then sell at that country store. So the reason why the number was so low is because, one, I only had lilies as a focal. I had some dahlias, but like we're talking about like 60% of those bouquets all being lilies. So we know that not everyone loves lilies or has cats that might eat the lilies, and lilies are toxic. So there's that piece of it. And then the second piece is, again, similar to a farmer's market, this stuff takes time to build in terms of awareness that you are there. So we're going to see how next year goes, but I am going to put some more effort to seeing if I can make stems move and have that be a reliable outlet for me. So now that we've talked about my flower sales, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the 55% of sales that did not come from me selling flowers. So we're going to start off by talking about YouTube, because everything built off of YouTube here. So you as a viewer and everyone else who views my videos contribute to this number that I'm about to talk about. So you might get ads, you might pay for YouTube Premium. Whether or not you fall into either of those buckets, YouTube actually compensates monetized creators for having videos and those views. So I will do likely another video that's a little bit more in depth about YouTube and just how much YouTube pay me and like the details on that piece. But high level this year, I made $3,887.42 off of YouTube. So this was my first year where I had a full year of monetization. And I would say that that monetization didn't start picking up into like, we'll call it like May, June of this year. And then there were points where when I went back to work, it kind of fell off because I wasn't able to create as much content. So $3,887 is nothing to sneeze at. It helps certainly with the farm, but when you think about the amount of time that I spend on making YouTube content, it isn't even close to compensating me for that. So I would say that as a general rule of thumb, it comes out to about a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning for every 1 minute that you see on YouTube as a video, it takes me 3 minutes to produce that. That 3 minutes looks like me filming it. Sometimes it takes a couple of takes. Obviously, if I'm outside doing something, I'm gonna have to move the camera or whatever it is. It takes longer to do stuff outside because I'm filming, but then I'm also editing it. Sometimes I have to, again, like reshoot, right? So there's a lot of effort that goes into that piece of it. And so it's looking like a 3-to-1 type of ratio. And now that I have a Patreon, it's actually turning a little bit more of a 4-to-1, but we'll talk about the Patreon piece a little bit after. So the YouTube piece of it in of itself right now is not something that I consider super profitable because the labor is just so high. Now, I think that in future years, as I have a more established viewer base and things just start snowballing and compounding, then yes, YouTube can actually become a profitable piece of the business. Now, I will say that at this point, I consider YouTube to be a part of the flower farming income of b.a.r.e Flower Farm, and it is a priority for me to sustain it. And this is why, because one of the subtle opportunities that came knocking at the door, which I almost missed, was how YouTube is technically what we called a lead gen in the marketing world, or lead generation, which means that YouTube is funneling to me all of these people who are interested in flower farming content, who are fellow flower farmers. They're funneling them into my funnel, my marketing funnel, if you've watched my video. So not from a flower sales perspective, but from a flower farming, bulbs, corms, and other type of things related to flower farming perspective. So corms, ranunculus corms, right? Last year in 2022, I wanted to buy corms at wholesale prices, but I didn't need the wholesale quantities. So it was like, I'll just sell the quantities that I don't need. And it was a success. So then this year, I was like, should I do that again? And that was one of those things where I literally had this light bulb moment. I was like, yes, you should do it because you are getting more viewers on YouTube. These are people who can't necessarily afford to pay the wholesale prices again because they don't need like 500 of a single color. There's this gap right now that exists where you have retail or you have wholesale, but you've got all of these growers in between who need something that's in between, right? They don't want to pay retail prices and they need more than just retail quantities. They don't need those wholesale quantities. So you're starting to see people fill that hole, but there's like no one who's doing it in a consistent manner, right? Like I think Jake from Facebook is probably the biggest one out there, but there needs to be a lot more Jakes out there and doing it in a way that's like easy, right? Like on Shopify or like on a website for you to check out without getting invoices all the time, right? So I think that people are finally realizing that this is a gap, and I recognize that this is a gap with ranunculus corm. So I doubled my ranunculus corm order this year from my wholesale supplier. And what do you know? I basically sold out within a few weeks. So I had to place another order. And that is how I got to this corms number of $6,157. So it was one of those things where I was like, okay, let's just see how many people from YouTube would be interested in buying my corms. And I actually did this again, not for me. I did this for a local nursery who was having a hard time selling perennials. I went over on one of my days off. I filmed a tour of their nursery, and what do you know? They got a few $1,000s in sales after that video. So this is the reason, honestly, why a lot of YouTube creators prioritize their channels. It's not just for the YouTube revenue, but it's because YouTube is such an effective way of collecting leads into this marketing funnel. So along with the corms also came with the tulip bulbs. I would say that the tulip bulbs I didn't sell as much of just because the tulip bulbs are already high priced when they come to me. There's not that much to market up. And if I market up too much, then it almost becomes unprofitable for the fellow flower farmer who I'm selling to, right? And that is like a main priority for me. When I'm selling things to you guys, I want to make sure that there is still enough of a margin in there for you guys to achieve some sort of profitability. Like it was really important to me to be able to keep those bulbs under $1. The reason why you see a lot of flower farmers selling wholesale tulip bulbs above $1 is because that's really the only way for them to make it worth their time to sell their bulbs. Because otherwise they could be growing them as stems, right? Like, is it worth it for someone to sell a bulb for like 20, 30 cents in profit potentially after you embed the costs of your labor, the packaging, sometimes like we all take a hit on shipping, right? So there's a bunch of different phantom or hidden costs that people don't think about that decrease the value of that bulb. Because I'm getting a bulb in anywhere from like 35 to 50 cents wholesale, and I'm marking it up to like 85 to 95 cents to ship, including shipping. I'm actually not making that much on a bulb, versus if I were to keep that bulb and grow it, then I can make at least like $1 to $1.30 per bulb, right? So just some considerations there. But all in all, to say, YouTube was one of my biggest ahas this year in terms of an opportunity. And I say this in full transparency because this could be disheartening for some of you guys who are just flower farming. You guys are not creating content in the form of YouTube videos, podcasts, or whatever it is. And you're probably asking yourself, so like, am I confined to just like half of the sales that Jesse had? And the answer could be yes or no, right? Like, when you flower farm, everyone's numbers are going to look drastically different depending on how you sell those flowers. I've said repeatedly in the past that the best way to add value onto your flowers is to do something with them, provide an experience, right? So a U-pick, a bouquet bar, right? A workshop, or you can provide a design skill as a part of the cost, and design skill is going to be upcharged a lot more than any stem could fetch, right? So even if you grow the best ranunculus, the best roses, they are never going to fetch as much as if you were to put them into a professionally crafted skill arrangement. And that's why florists are able to charge so much, right? You go to a florist because you expect a beautiful design. So think about other ways that you can upcharge what you are selling through experience or skill. And in my case, like whether or not I like it, I kind of fell into this role of a content creator. I would say that from when I was pretty young, like back in college, I had a food blog. I was always like writing and creating content. And even for my other e-commerce company, I was of course creating social media content, right, to get people into my marketing funnel. So I've been creating content for a lot of time. It's not as hard for me to create content. And that was kind of one of my realizations, which is lean into your experiences and your strength. Make content. It seems to be content that people actually want to listen to. And there's nothing wrong with then monetizing that content through YouTube ad revenue and then providing an added additional value or service in terms of filling a gap that no one else is filling. And I would say that most of you guys who brought my corms are probably happier that you were able to find corms at a relatively reasonable price than needing to go to a retailer or having to figure out how to buy wholesale and split those corms. So I felt like that was a lot of time just dedicated to the revenue part of my 2023. And that's not even the part that I wanted to talk in detail about. I wanted to talk about how much it cost me to get to that number. So enter costs, and this is probably where you want to refill on your cup of coffee. So my costs, let's start with last year. My costs in 2022 added up to about $13,800. That was year one. There was a lot of costs related to infrastructure. We put up a deer fence, which was like close to $3,000. We rented some heavy machinery in order to lift the sod. We just did a lot of stuff that obviously you need to incur in year one. Some of those things will be used throughout the lifespan of the farm, such as the deer fence, some things not, right? But the point is that they're costs that you need to start up. So last year was a pretty high cost year, and I would be lying to you if I didn't admit that when I added up my costs for this year, I was not only surprised that they were substantially higher, but I didn't expect them to be higher because we had already incurred so much of the upfront cost. Now, a bit more context here. We ended up taking on some projects that I did not expect we would take on this year at this time. The most relevant being constructing a pole barn, because I wanted to scale my winter tulips and could not do that without our pole barn. Like, we were running out of room in our attached garage. We also use our garage as a CrossFit gym, so that just wasn't possible, and there were a lot of critters in that garage. So if you build a new structure, obviously it's going to be a lot more tight, less likely for critters to get in there. So we ended up taking on the pole barn project, and I'm not adding the cost of the pole barn into the farm expenses, but there are some things that happen as a result of the pole barn that then added additional expenses that I was expecting to incur later on. So for example, we ended up buying a tractor this year because while we were in the process of figuring out how do we reseed the area that was excavated to prevent erosion, we went out to get multiple quotes, and it was going to cost us like $6,000 to $7,000 to just reseed our grass. I mean, we have a lot of acreage that got dug up, but not so much that you would think would be like $7,000. I thought it was going to be like $2,000. So at that point, Eric said to me, hey, why don't we take that money that we would have spent in landscaping and put that towards a tractor? That's practically like a third of the cost of a tractor. And I was like, yeah, good idea. So we ended up buying a tractor. And with that tractor, obviously comes a lot of nice attachments that you could have that could be relevant for the farm. So for example, one big attachment that we bought was a forklift. So that forklift cost was about $1,500 for this piece of metal. And I did put that on the farm books expenses. In fact, I was adamant that the farm pay for that. So the corms, the profit for my corms paid for that forklift. And the reason why I was adamant that we pay for that was because I did need a forklift. So for example, when they shipped our tulip bulbs by freight, it came on a pallet. They can bring it back to you, but it's not gonna they're not going to bring it to you in the location that you want. So a tractor was really, really helpful in terms of picking up that pallet and bring it to where we needed it. I was also able to use that forklift attachment to bring pallets of crates of lilies to extend my season. So I do see this attachment being used quite a bit in the future, but it was a pretty big hunk of change. So you have that. And then you have some other expenses that are what I would also call one-time expenses for 2023 that I don't expect in later years. So the biggest category here, outside of bulb, seeds, and corms, which we'll get to after, is actually YouTube related expenses. So I ended up buying a new computer. It's a Mac Studio computer. After being really frustrated editing on Eric's Surface laptop, it would take me literally hours to try to export, and it would take me so much time to edit because it kept on freezing. The processor just wasn't like strong enough. So I bought a Mac Studio, and let me tell you, that Mac Studio, even though it cost like close to $2,000, was worth every single penny because it processes like butter. I have cut down my editing time to a fraction of what it used to take. I can create more videos. I don't need to be at the computer trying to like will it to process and export, right? So that stuff is really worth it in my view. I always look at an investment as, okay, how many more bouquets do I need to sell? How many more videos do I need to make for it to be worth it? And if it's this like really small answer, like I only need to sell 2 or 3 more bouquets for it to be worth the value, then it's an obvious yes to buying it, right? So I bought a computer, and then we also bought a drone on Black Friday. A drone was always on my list, but I wanted to be sure that I was going to really continue making YouTube content before I bought the drone. And I think a lot of you have actually already commented that you guys enjoyed the footage in the beginning. So that was a hefty investment. That drone was $800 on a Black Friday deal, plus all of the accessories. You buy more batteries, you buy like a case, you buy whatever, like we're close to $1,000 on a drone. But again, in my view, totally worth it because I think it's really gonna up the game of our YouTube videos. Let's now go back to this topic of bulb, seeds, corms, and plugs. So I racked up $9,573, almost $10,000 in that arena, which sounds like a lot for a second-year flower farmer. But I guess it's all relative, right? Because there are really big farms where this is a really small number to them. And then there's the typical, hobbyist flower farmer who this number feels astronomical to. The thing about this number is that it's always really difficult to differentiate truly how much of that was related to my 2023 flowers. Because, for example, all the tulip bulbs that I bought for next year, right? Like I have sold about 500 stems in December of 2023, but out of the 10,000, that means, I've got like another 9,500 that are going to be sold next year. I already paid for those bulbs in 2023, and that's in that $9,600 number. So we pay a lot up front for things that we will recognize later, but this is something that is going to reoccur. And if you are planning on growing your business, then each year this number is actually going to get bigger. So what I'm trying to say is that this number is not fully representative of the true 2023 costs, because some of that cost is being carried into next year, which I will then recognize the revenue on. But that being said, the biggest piece of this number, this $9,600 number, was tulip bulbs, which shouldn't be a surprise because tulips are my specialty. Tulips here accounted for basically about, I would say like 45% of that entire number. So it gives you an idea for how many tulips I grew. The other thing is that last year I actually did not buy a lot from plugs. I did not even do a lot of direct seeding. And that's actually something I probably should have mentioned in the flower sales section, which was that because I knew I was having a kid, I overwintered a lot. So I paid for a lot of plugs in 2022. So in 2023, those plugs grew. I had some attrition through thrips, had to cut off all my feverfew, didn't really get to sell my Rudbeckia or snaps, but still made quite a bit profit on those plugs. Afterwards, I didn't really buy any plugs. The only plugs I bought were like mountain mint, and that didn't necessarily flower. Like some of it flowered, but most of it is for this year and the next few years. So I didn't really have a lot of costs in that arena, but I did buy a lot of lily bulbs. So lily bulbs were really my primary flower of succession planting, and that's how I was able to get lilies from basically June all the way through November. I primarily planted lilies. And so I had some stuff that volunteered from just being on the ground. I had some compost that didn't get hot enough that we were putting on the beds, and that also sprouted. So I was able to also sell some flowers through that. But for the most part, I would say that I would expect my number for next year to be a lot higher. Now, this does include a few trays of like Lysianthus and other stuff that I am getting in for the spring, because you have to order now in order to get them in by like April. But for the most part, like this number is definitely going to go up, I think, next year. So a couple more categories to go through. The next biggest category was 8% at office supplies and software. So this number is $1,500 or like $1,583 to be precise. The lion's share of that number was a brand new laptop that I'm using right now. So I was previously using a 12-year-old MacBook Pro, and for all intents and purposes, it was fine. But then I got to this point in November where I was thinking, how am I going to move all 10,000 of my tulip stems? Because my CSA isn't going to cut it. I'm only going to move at most like 1,500 stems through that. So enter in another opportunity that was subtly knocking at my door that I almost didn't recognize, and that was, why don't I ship wholesale to florists who are in like a close vicinity to me geographically, right? So I'm talking about like neighboring states, maybe out to Chicago at most. I've gotten requests for like California, and I try to pass them on to other growers who I know because I want to minimize that carbon footprint. And honestly, it just doesn't make sense for the end buyer to pay that high shipping rate anyway, because we're shipping on overnight. But I bring all this up because then I needed a new computer. Just shipping all of those corms on my old laptop was so frustrating. It was taking a lot of time. I should have upgraded then. And this is, again, one of those things where you invest in a really nifty tool like a laptop for the purposes of shipping, and then it pays dividends elsewhere. So if you're a Patreon member, you'll probably notice that there was a huge uptick in the number of posts that I had since like the last couple of months, because I had a laptop that was no longer running out of battery every like 20, 30 minutes. I was able to take this laptop around with me. I was able to basically like write in my off time in a way that I wouldn't have been able to before. So this laptop will pay itself back, and I feel like has already paid itself back in ways that you can't put a price tag on it, right? So I always believe in investing in technology if you feel like you're going to be able to get a lot of use out of it. Now, another category where I also really believe in investing in is education. So education in the form of workshops, in the form of upskilling something that you're not good at, or to get exposure to something that you know very little about. So this year, my education and workshops came out to $1,217. I took a couple of workshops worth noting that I've talked about before. I took the Lily workshop. That was about $600. So again, you know, I probably could have pieced a lot of information that floats online for free. I liked having it in one spot, and I also liked the ability to go to a closed Facebook group to ask about questions that I might have, or to look at questions that other people have. I would say that this was money very well spent because I went pretty big in lilies. It became my second biggest crop. And now I've kind of become a farmer that thinks about how can I use programmable crops to fill in the gaps of the year when other people don't have flowers, right? So it really aligns with my original vision of focusing on the shoulder and winter seasons when few others have flowers around me, because my goal is to minimize that carbon footprint of imported flowers, right? So things are starting to come together. I'm still definitely going to grow outside, because the drawback of programmable crops is that you're not really practicing a lot of like regenerative agriculture practices with them. I mean, you can, but you're less likely to, right? So it's still really important for me to really like nurture my soil, to make sure that I am taking care of the ground outside. And for that reason, I will always be growing something in ground. It's just a matter of what. So I invested in the Lily workshop. That was $600. I invested in a shipping course. So for someone with an e-commerce background, I only shipped non-perishable goods, which is very different than shipping perishable goods. So I invested, I think it was like $125 with the discount that I had. $125 well spent, already made that all back. Another thing that actually fit into this category was a membership for the cooperative Cal Flowers. It's like $340 a year to get the discounted rates of overnight shipping. So that is another cost that I know I will make back very, very quickly through shipping of my winter tulip stems. All of those expenses that I just talked about added up to roughly 3/4 of all of my expenses. So I feel like I got the majority of them, but in aggregate, all of my expenses were, again, $19,906, which begs the ultimate question. What was your profitability this year? So again, profitability is a really easy equation, revenue minus costs. I was actually profitable in year 2. I brought in $3,798 with a huge, huge asterisk, because there are a lot of things that we did not talk about here in terms of costs that really should be considered. So before I talk about those though, I want to talk about, we haven't even considered year 1 yet. So when you factor in year one, I was about $7,900 in the hole. So I am now climbing out of this hole, but I am still in a red negative zone after year 2. And I think after year 3, I should be able to have climbed out of that hole, assuming that I am not aggressively investing in a way that I am buying like a huge amount of corms or having infrastructure put up, which I don't plan to right now. But I do think that I should be able to be totally profitable in year 3 at the rate that I am going. But it is worth talking about a bunch of things that I did not consider, which would technically make me unprofitable. So the first part is just, there are these big expenses that I mentioned earlier, the pole barn, the tractor, that I did not completely factor into these numbers. When we get time to do our taxes and accounting, our accountant is going to put these numbers in and depreciate them over time. Similar even to like my computer, right? Like the computer is a pretty big cost, but it's not just like a one-time cost that is for 2023. It's going to be smoothed out over a few years through something that we call depreciation, right? But that's like more from like a tax accounting perspective. So the question is like, do I put a fifth of my pole barn into these expenses because that's what we're using for winter tulips? How much of my tractor do I put onto the farm use, right? Because we have been using the tractor quite a bit for landscaping this year, but the tractor will definitely play a pretty big role on the farm. So things that I'm still trying to figure out in terms of just how that fits in. Labor is the biggest one here. I have not talked about labor at all. So even though in my other recent videos, I've talked about tracking my labor and everything, I have not yet put labor as a line item here. Next year, I will, because I think by virtue of me tracking how much things cost, I can then actually say, okay, like in the month of January, this is how many hours I spent and equate that to a final number. I'm also going to raise my cost per hour of labor from $15 to $20 next year. So we're gonna see how much that impacts things. And there's a variety of reasons why I'm raising it. I feel like when I first started out on the $15 number about a year and a half ago, it felt reasonable. And with inflation and everything else, $20 just feels a lot safer here. Mileage. I actually did not put in mileage here. I will from an accounting point of view. Mileage is one of those things that does add up. I mentioned how far away my co-op is from me. I do CSA deliveries, even though eventually I'm going to hire that out. That still is a business expense, and you would be surprised as to how much you can deduct from your taxes if you were to count up your mileage. So don't forget about that during tax season. The last thing here is utilities. So utilities is interesting for us because we run on well water, which means that we technically don't pay for water in the form of a water bill, but obviously we pay for electricity. So electricity to keep the refrigerators on as a cooler, that's a really big expense. Then there's this time of year where I'm running my grow lights to grow the winter tulips. Less of an expense, but an expense that adds up over time as you're doing it for like 4 months. Growing your seedlings, right? Like all of that also does take electricity to put your lights on. So all this to say, there are a bunch of other, I always call these phantom costs, things that you don't really consider or think about that are going to really pull down your profitability. So, I think on paper, I was profitable, but in reality, if you were to count these things in, I am still not profitable. I do think that it is important for all of us to know our numbers, get these on paper so that at least you have a good realistic idea of where you stand, right? Like I know that in year 2, despite all the things that I dealt with, I had a lot of growth, that this thing has potential for me to continue spending my time on. And that is the last thing that I'm going to talk about before I end this video, which is that I had someone who I was talking to online. This person hasn't grown a lot of stuff before, but is starting to grow. I think it was like Lysianthus. And I said, honestly, you're better off just buying them in plugs. I'm growing them from seed because my dad wants some, and I'm not gonna buy plugs for him for his, little cut garden in his backyard. So I grew some from seed, more for my dad, and also to see if I could do it. But if you were to add up the cost of your time and labor, it's going to be a lot more expensive than you just buying a couple of trays. If you're growing thousands of Lysianthus, this might be a different story. But she said to me, oh, my labor is free. Like, I'm not going to be doing anything else. And I was like, your labor is not free. Even though you might not be doing something else that's going to pay you, there is always an opportunity cost of us spending time farming. A lot of us have children. A lot of us have families. A lot of us are even caretakers of elderly people. The time that you spend out doing farming related tasks is time taken away from spending time with your loved ones. So that is your true opportunity cost. Are you spending a lot of time on borrowed time after dinner, running yourself into exhaustion and not knowing what your numbers on to know if it's worth it? Now, if you're growing for just pure hobby and this is something fun for you, you're not thinking about it as a business, this piece is irrelevant for you. But if you are looking to actually create a profitable farming business, you need to keep records to be able to get to a year-end reflection like I just did in this video, to then have a conversation with yourself to say, one, is this worth my time? Two, where are the places where I can improve, where I can see growth? Because if you don't have this data to inform you going to 2024, it's kind of like the blind leading the blind. And I think that the worst trade-off is potentially spending time away from your loved ones, right? Like everyone knows this, like life is not given, right? Tomorrow is not given for every one of us. So you have to make sure that when you are spending your time, you feel like you're spending it wisely and you're not going to regret later down the line that you did not make the right type of prioritizations because you didn't keep track of the numbers. So that is it. That was a lot. I hope that this gives you a really good insight into what farming for a second year side hustle could look like, and just where my head is even going for 2024. I'm pretty excited for 2024. I'm trialing some new things that I've never grown, and again, shifting a lot of my growing for the co-op because I want to make each trip down to that co-op worth it. And I think that I can still grow my business while doing that. So the winter tulips are going really, really well, to the point where I just bought 1,000 more tulips. I can't believe I'm saying that. I thought 10,000 was going to be such a struggle, but honestly, like, I feel like I can't grow enough at this point. So a lot more to come on that. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And again, I have a Patreon if you want more details and just this kind of stuff listed out in article format. I'll put that in the link below. But I hope everyone has a happy and healthy start to their 2024, and I will see you in the next video.